They're going to have to do it against an athletic TCU team, but luckily the Red Raiders are at the USA. What they need to do to win coming up on today's Locked On Texas Tech.
You are Locked On Texas Tech, your daily podcast on the Texas Tech Red Raiders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Texas Tech, a member of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. I'm Ryan Mainville. I cover Texas Tech for the Dallas Morning News, and I'm joined by Emery Lida, a longtime Texas Tech analyst, writer, and podcaster. Today we are here to break down the Texas Tech TCU game. It's one that I've been looking forward to for a while. This TCU team is really interesting to me. I think that I've flipped my stance on where they're at in terms of competition level and just pure talent multiple times, multiple big swings over the course of the season. In fact, I think I said some pretty regrettable things on our Big 12 Power Rankings episode that I wish I could take back now, but hindsight is always 2020. Horned Frogs come into this game 16-5. They are 6-4. Or 5-4 in Big 12 play, excuse me. They just got a win over Oklahoma State at home just by 2 points. Just managed to skid by that one. But other than that, they've been pretty consistent for the most part. Just haven't really been an explosively competitive or bad team at this point in the season.
Yeah, TCU's resume looks very interesting at this point. I mean, you're talking about a team that already has 4 Q1 wins, which looks pretty good. Obviously, they picked up a couple decent wins in non-conference wins over Texas A&M, which has been okay this season. Obviously, the standout win over LSU in the Big 12 SEC Challenge. That was probably the highlight of their season. And they've also been able to sweep Oklahoma, which, as we know, is no easy task, and they've also won against Iowa State. They've had a couple nice games. Obviously, teams like Oral Roberts don't look great on paper, but certainly like those mid-major teams are good or can be a challenge. But I mean, this TCU team in general, I mean, it's a team that coming into the season was projected to be, I believe, 8th or ninth in the Big 12. I think they were picked 8th in the preseason. And for a lot of non-conference, it seemed like they were going to be right in that sort of range. They looked like a team that would, after losing to Santa Clara, they looked like a team that was probably destined to be one of those teams that would be kind of competitive, but not really up there in the Big 12. And then they got off to a pretty decent start. Obviously, mentioned sweeping Oklahoma. They beat Iowa State. They managed to have, obviously, the win over LSU, and you just had all of the success piling up. But then recently, it just sort of cooled off on them. They had a big loss to Texas right before that LSU game that really kind of threw into question just how strong of a team they are. But managed to rally back, and then again suffered another setback, this time a home loss to Kansas State. But then just recently, they were able to squeak out a win over Oklahoma State. So they've had their ups and downs. Their schedule's about to get a lot more difficult coming up. They have games against Kansas on the road, Baylor on the road, Tech on the road, and then also they have Texas on the road. So that's the 4 best teams in the conference. I'm confident saying that. All of them on the road. And I mean, this is going to pick up for them. They're, as of now, looking like a tournament team, but certainly that could easily fade down the stretch.
Yeah, not an easy stretch of upcoming games for them by any stance. I'm sure they will wish that they had that Kansas State game back to take a win where they could get one. But in terms of the pure numbers, TCU is currently 56th in KenPom thanks to their 28th ranked defense and their 104th ranked offense. That's actually not the worst adjusted offensive efficiency in the Big 12. Oklahoma State and Iowa State are both lower than them. But I would go as far to say that I think TCU is the worst offense in the Big 12 right now. There's nothing really exciting for me outside of Mike Miles. They are one of the worst 3-point shooting teams in the country. They don't shoot the free throw well. They're not incredibly great from 2-point range. They don't take a lot of shots. There's just not a lot to like. And really the most redeeming thing about their offense has been their offensive rebounding ability. Now, they've been a phenomenal offensive rebounding team, and that has given opponents a lot of trouble. They're currently averaging 14.1 offensive rebounds per game, which is really just incredible and is second in the country. So that's a big, big number for them. And that's something that they've used a lot to their success. But in terms of everything else, I think Mike Miles is a really good player. We're going to talk about him in our next segment. But outside of him, man, there's just not a lot here that gets me excited. And I overlooked that a little bit in the Texas loss. But looking back now, it's just hard to kind of consider the offensive value of this team.
Yeah, their offensive rebounding is legitimately elite. You look at percentages, and they're the best offensive rebounding team in the country. And in conference play, they've been by far the best team in conference. So they've got that going for them. But beyond that, I mean, they're not a good shooting team at all. We thought the Tech shooting is bad. Somehow, TCU is shooting worse from the field. And I think some of that has to do with Mike Miles being banged up. He's not quite as good of a shooter with his wrist being bothered. And certainly, he's had to take a really high degree of difficulty shot. And then obviously you have their wings. None of them outside of Chuck O'Bannon are particularly great from the 3-point range. But even then, I mean, it'd be one thing if their shooting wasn't great, but they really, outside of Miles, don't have anyone that can put a ton of consistent pressure on the rim either. Their inside finishing outside of on putbacks and whatnot isn't particularly great. I mean, guys like Emanuel Miller have been pretty good, but you also have their guards have struggled at times to finish at the rim. And so it's just in general been a real struggle for them offensively. And it sucks because they've got decent ball handlers. Like we mentioned, Miles, they've got Damian Ball, the transfer from Memphis. They've got a couple other guys that have handled some PVH duties at times this season, but it just hasn't really come together offensively. But defensively, their athleticism has really helped them out. And I think that they're probably one of the best perimeter defenses in the Big 12, and especially when it comes to being able to defend off the ball. I think that they have a collection of defenders that have done a really good job of not giving up easy cuts and easy access baskets. And even though their 3-point defense isn't particularly great, it's still pretty good. It's still one of those things where if you look at this TCU team on tape, their athleticism just stands out to you, and they're so switchable. I mean, you look at a team like Tech, and they're probably the most switchable team in the conference, but TCU is not far behind, and they can do so much with their lineups in terms of putting large wings on guards. They can run small ball. They can do a lot when it comes to just sort of switching up their defensive approach. And I think it makes them a really intriguing team on that end, but offensively, it's just a struggle for them.
Yeah, I mean, you look at their defensive numbers, and it's kind of interesting. I think if you didn't watch film, you might not think this defense is very good. I mean, they don't get a lot of steals, they don't block a lot of shots. You mentioned they're a top 100 3-point defense, but it's not exceptional. They haven't protected the rim well. They don't create a lot of turnovers. Like on paper, they just look like a pretty mediocre defense. But in terms of the way that their athleticism and roster allows them to play within their system and switch and just be really versatile on the perimeter, it makes them a really, really difficult team to play against. And like I mentioned, they're one of the top 50 teams in KenPom defense right now. I think a lot of that just has to do with the ability that they move so well and they switch really, really well. And it's been clear that Jamie Dixon has really not been playing around with his defense. And I mean, he really can't. He doesn't have very many other options because there's just nothing going for him offensively. And so he's just really cut down his rotation in conference play, really playing just 7 guys right now, with Xavier Court kind of getting some spot minutes here and there where necessary. But like a 7-man rotation where every single guy can play within your system, move really well, switch on and off the ball. It's just a really exciting and interesting team to watch. They're very, very dynamic defensively, and even though they don't necessarily stick out anywhere statistically, it's a good defense. And I think that you do want to look at the numbers and you do want to point to something that says, hey, maybe there is a hint here that this team is a good defensive team. Look at the free throws. Opponents are shooting just 13.1 free throws against them per game. That's 20th best in the country. So their athleticism allows them to stay in front of guys and not send them to the free throw line, which is something that Texas Tech will certainly have to look to counteract, especially as they get to the rim. But again, Jamie Dixon is just relying a ton on his defense right now, and he has to. You look at the numbers in conference play, TCU is last in field goal attempts, 2-point attempts, 3-point attempts, free throw percentage, and points. So they are struggling to find really anything. But as long as they have that defense, they are going to be competitive. I want to take a look at some of the players that are making this thing go for TCU, but first, a word from our sponsors. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before as football continues its march through the playoffs right to the big game this Sunday. BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just football. BetOnline has up-to-the-minute info on pro and college hoops, NHL, boxing, UFC, along with live real-time updates of current games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the new amazing offers available for the 2022 season. BetOnline, where the game starts. It's Super Week, brought to you by Get Upside, and there's no better place to get coverage of the big game than the Locked On NFL podcast. Locked On Bengals and Locked On Rams are in LA all week covering the big game, which is currently on pace to be the hottest Super Bowl ever played. A little interesting tidbit there, but thank you for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms and are here talking TCU Texas Tech on Saturday. Little day game for the Red Raiders back at the USA for the first time since Chris Beard's return. And they are going to look for a victory and not lose 2 in a row. But first, they're going to have to account for Mike Miles, who is really, in my opinion, one of the best scorers in the Big 12. He's battled some injuries this year, hasn't really been whole. He's missed, I think, their last 2 games, or for sure their last game against Oklahoma State. I think both of his wrists are sprained right now, which is just crazy. And there's no definitive on him playing in this game, but I know that it is very likely from some of the TCU guys that I've seen reporting on this. Shout out to Colin Post, who's just been doing amazing work covering TCU this season. But Mike Miles, man, 12.7 points per game, 3.3 assists, 3.6 boards. Hasn't been shooting the ball particularly well in conference play. He's sub 30. But shooting about 5 attempts per game, gets to the free throw line frequently and efficiently. His field goal percentage is way down in conference play. He was shooting about 50% on the season, but is down to about 32.6% in conference play. A lot of that has to do with his shot kind of cooling off a bit, but I mean, this guy, he just scores and he wins. And this offense, it does not scare me. I don't think that this TCU team is going to win very many games because of their offense. But if you don't account for Mike Miles, this is a guy that can have an Emoja Gibson type game against you and create shots at his own will and force your defense into a really tough spot.
Yeah, the thing about Mike Miles is Texas Tech only had to face him once last year because the second TCU game ended up never happening because of COVID. And so the only memory that I feel like a lot of Tech fans have of Mike Miles is a 2-point performance where he missed all his 3-point shots. And while his stats this year might not jump off the page and certainly struggled some with efficiency, it's still been a year in which you can see just how much emphasis teams have to put on him defensively because he is their number one option. He's the guy that is best at creating their shots. And I feel like he's made a step forward in playmaking this year. I think that's something that even though the numbers aren't particularly great offensively, we've seen his assist rate jump up. We've seen him in general make higher read passes. He's been relied on more to be a lead guard. And that's something that I think is the next step for him as in developing as a player and something he really had to work on coming back from last year. The efficiency is concerning. I think the wrist injury has something to do with it. I know he was playing through injury even before he sit out the last couple of games. I think he might have aggravated the other wrist, which is why he had to sit out. But certainly he's someone that when he's on, he can be a really effective offensive player. I think he's good at getting to the rim and drawing fouls. I would say finishing at the rim is something that he's still got to work on, but certainly he's a dynamic offensive option. And so long as he plays, I think he's going to be the number one guy that Tech has to really focus on stopping because outside of him, you really look at the rest of the roster and it's full of guys that have potential. Certainly, Davian Ball is another name that comes to mind, the transfer out of Memphis. And then you also have guys like Micah Peavy, who we know all too well, Chuck O'Bannon. But then Emanuel Miller as well. But in general, as far as guards go, it's Miles' team when it comes to getting the offense set up, running it through him, and kind of being the figurehead of this operation. So being able to stop him is going to be critical because, like you mentioned, he's the guy that could absolutely have an Emoja Gibson type night and just go off for a really efficient afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even his team in the guards. Like, this is his team. He's really the engine of this offensive. Like, anything they want to do offensively, it's got to go through him. If it doesn't, it's probably not going to end super well. But I do think that he's a guy that you've got to account for. You kind of brushed over Ba. I want to go back to him for a second because he's really stepped up in conference play, averaging 12.2 points per game in Big 12 contests, not shooting the ball particularly well. Another guy that's shooting at right about 25%. So very similar profile to Mike Miles, a guy that um, really has the ball in his hands a lot, but he has just clearly not adjusted to the primary ball handler role super well. You can tell that he had not played very many minutes at that position at Memphis and is averaging about 4.4 turnovers per game in Big 12 contests right now, which is sky high. But in terms of, Mike Miles is really primary threat number one, but Ba is really good. Emery, what have you seen from his tape that's allowed him to score, at a pretty efficient clip? I mean, he's better than Miles, hasn't been shooting, or he has better efficiency than Miles, I should clarify. Not particularly from deep, but just an overall field goal percentage. And then, as I mentioned, his average is slowly creeping up towards Miles.
Well, he relies quite a bit on his burst and athleticism, and I think that that's something that when it comes to driving, he's seemingly known his strength quite a bit. And I think that you look at his ability to get to the rim and finish there, and that's probably the biggest strength that he has as a player. He's only shooting 62% on the year, which doesn't sound great, but over the course of conference play, he's really kind of picked that up, and he's done well at absorbing contact and finding ways to both draw fouls and also finish at the rim. And I think that's kind of the key. He's obviously probably a better pure driver than Miles. Certainly, he can get out of control at times. He's had issues with turnovers, which is, to me, equal parts him being a little bit over ambitious and also him struggling from a passing standpoint. But from a pure driving standpoint, he's got a burst that really only a few other guards in the conference have. And I think that obviously he's got a lot of work to do as a ball handler just to kind of be able to carry on that primary load. But certainly he's a driver, man. He can finish well. I think the shot is not quite there. That's something that has been an issue for him all the way back to when he was being recruited. And actually, he had Tech in his final three in 2020. He was one of the last high school recruits that Chris Beard went after. Didn't manage to get him. Obviously, Penny Hardaway got him at Memphis, and that went absolutely great for Penny, like most of his recruits have. But certainly, Ball is someone that has that sort of burst and ability to finish at the rim. And as far as ball handlers go, like I think he's not as reliable as what Miles is, but in terms of efficiency and kind of knowing his strengths, I think he probably does a better job of being able to just kind of fit in the offense and play efficiently.
I don't even remember Tech recruiting Ba. That's an interesting nugget there. Outside of the guards, man, I mean, Micah Peavy's on this team. He's kind of the same dude that he was at Tech. Just can't really find ways to contribute
He's
offensively
shot threes
consistently.
though. He hasn't made threes, but he shot them.
He is he's shooting them all right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a way to describe it. He is 3 for 22 on the season. That's a cool 13.6%. So good for him, man. Getting his shots up. But outside of PV and some of these other guys that we may be familiar with, two bigs that I really, really like are Emanuel Miller and Eddie Lampkin. Eddie Lampkin was on this TCU team last season, but barely saw the floor. And man, this dude is just a tank. This is a big dude. And where he's not scoring, he's been really, really good at crashing the offensive glass, averaging 3.2 offensive rebounds in Big 12 games this season. That's just nuts. Then Emanuel Miller, a transfer from A&M, scoring 9.4 points and grabbing 6.4 rebounds per game in conference play this season. I've been impressed with these two guys, especially with their ability to fit into TCU's defensive system. Lampkin's been struggling a little bit more in that regard, but I mean these are two big dudes that are definitely going to be able to match Texas Tech's pure size down low. Now, they might not match Texas Tech's talent down low, but in terms of looking around the conference and just seeing the rarity that two big man lineups have become, this is one of those teams that Texas Tech is going to see that's going to play with a similar size to them in the front court.
Yeah, and in a way, we'll get into keys and predictions in a minute, but that makes me a little bit more optimistic about this one because there's not any mismatch really one way or the other that either team can really exploit. And so it's going to come down more towards pure personnel and kind of just being able to execute game plan better. But certainly those two guys are keys to TCU's success. Lampkin's a really good offensive rebounder. Emanuel Miller is kind of like a jack of all trades. He's pretty versatile for his size, moves pretty well, and I think that allows them to switch particularly great. I don't think Lampkin quite has that switchability that Miller or some of Tech's bigs, for instance, have, but he's still a guy that's a really dangerous beast on the glass. It's gonna be critical to box him out on the offensive end and make sure he's not getting those putbacks. And then one more guy I wanted to touch on is Chuck O'Bannon Jr., and I think he's a guy that has been sort of inconsistent at points this year, but when he's had good games, he's had really good games, and he's been kind of the spark plug that they've needed at points. I mean, for me, that LSU game, I think he had a stretch where he had 3 consecutive really big threes and ended the game with 19 points. Was really important to their effort on that afternoon. And then he's had a couple of random games throughout the conference season sprinkled in as well. Obviously, coming off a big game against Oklahoma State a couple nights ago, he's a guy that could certainly catch fire, and I think is worth mentioning, even if he's had inconsistencies in games where he's just been invisible. And he's another kind of low usage guy, can't really create his own shot effectively. So it's going to be reliant on their ball handling to be able to get him good looks.
Yeah, 19 against LSU, 19 against Oklahoma State. Those are both season highs for him. Has been putting the ball in the basket pretty well after transferring from USC 2 seasons ago. But that's the TCU roster. We will get into our keys to the game and our predictions in our next segment. This is the time of the year that I've pretty much given up on all my New Year's resolutions, but not this year. I'm sticking to my resolution to eat right thanks to Built Bar. It almost feels like it's not a resolution because I actually enjoy eating Built Bar products. Have you tried the Puffs? If you haven't, you are missing out on one of Built Bar's best tasting bars. Puffs are the first ever protein infused marshmallow. They're not just a protein bar, they are a treat, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. Puffs are a fan favorite with some incredible flavors like churro, coconut marshmallow, and banana cream pie. So good. These are going to be your new favorite. They are low calorie and high in protein. You can just go ahead and replace your candy bars with these. They are better, not only for you, but also in flavor. So go to built.com and scroll down to the macros chart. You're going to be blown away, and you're going to want to add a few of these to your cart right away. They're high in protein, low in calorie, high in fiber, and low carb. Go to built.com today to grab a few of your own. TCU Texas Tech at the USA at 3 p.m. Central on Saturday. Red Raiders are looking to open their season series against TCU with a win before they go to Fort Worth in exactly 2 weeks from the day. So a very, very interesting matchup here. As we mentioned, athleticism is really where LSU hangs their hat. And so I'm just going to go ahead and get right into the meat of mine. I'm going to say my biggest key to the game for Texas Tech is do not replicate the offensive performance that you had against Oklahoma. Now, I know that sounds like a really broad and a really general thing to say because Texas Tech's offense was horrible against Oklahoma. Obviously, you don't want to replicate a game where you go 2 of 17 from deep. But what I mean is that you cannot let the ball stick and you cannot just lackadaisically dribble in the half court waiting for something to happen against this LSU team. I know that they don't create a lot of turnovers, but they are way too athletic for you to just wind the shot clock down and try and get something on the inside. You're going to have to force the issue with this team. They're not going to give you easy ones from the free throw line. I think you've got to stay aggressive. You've got to keep the ball moving. And if you're a guy like a Davion Warren, Kevin McCullough, a Terrence Shannon Jr., you got to get to the ball, to the basket. And so I think that's really the big key here against TCU.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the Oklahoma game, it was just a half-court disaster offensively. In the first half, it was kind of masked by the ability to get transition buckets, but certainly once the second half got going and OU did a better job of keeping the ball from being turned over. I mean, it really turned into a disaster offensively. And I think a lot of that comes from just not trying to force the ball into the post. I felt like at times Bryson Williams, whenever he would get hounded, they would just struggle to kind of move the ball out of there. I think that the ball, like you mentioned, the ball seemed to stick quite a bit. And it's something that Tech has done consistently better at home this year than on the road. And I think it's kind of interesting because I haven't really decided if it's down to the environment or if it's just kind of a coincidence that Tech has been able to move the ball better at home and in general run better half court offense. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, but I think at home in this environment, just getting off to a nice start, kind of forgetting about the OU game, constantly moving the ball well. I want to see a better game from the guards when it comes to decisiveness, whether it be driving to the lane or not passing up open looks, because I think that's one of the things that they could have done better against OU is there were a few opportunities in the half court where they had good lanes to the rim that they just didn't take for whatever reason. And then also they had a couple of shots, specifically Davion Warren and Adonis Arms, where they passed up in the half court. So just kind of looking at that and continuing to get back into the flow offensively. And I think you should be fine because on the defensive side of things, it's really this TCU team really lacks the weapons to challenge you in an extreme manner. They might hit some shots, obviously. They've got good offensive rebounding, so I guess boxing out is going to be key. But as far as individual talents, I don't think you're going to be at risk of getting Emoja Gibson again. Knock on wood on that one. But certainly this is not a good shooting team, and there's no individual that's been particularly great shooting threes. So we'll see. I think just executing rotations defensively, making sure you box out, and then offensively getting back into rhythm are the keys.
Yeah, I have no clue how to make sense of what Texas Tech is doing offensively on the road this season because, I mean, it's not even really like going against really difficult home court advantages. Like, Oklahoma might be the worst home court advantage in the Big 12 right now. Like, legitimately. Nobody goes to games there. There might have been more Red Raiders than there were Sooners there last night. I mean, it is not a difficult place to play. And so I really don't know if it's just the travel aspect of it or Texas Tech just trying to find their rhythm on the road. But I don't know, man. But it's been ugly. Luckily, they'll be back at the USA for this one. And hopefully, we'll have some increased offensive. Definitely with you on the boxing out point. That is really my and only two keys to the game. They've got to be able to move the ball well offensively, and then they cannot give TCU what they want on the offensive glass. Oklahoma was able to do that a little bit on Wednesday. It wasn't necessarily super noticeable, but Texas Tech we've seen them be a team that can really limit what other teams do on the glass, and they just did not have a striking advantage there. And so a team like TCU, which doesn't shoot the ball particularly well, you've got to be able to force them into difficult shots and then make them just get one shot every single possession. But overall, I feel pretty confident in a Texas Tech victory. I mean, I did when we previewed Oklahoma on Tuesday as well, and we all know how that went. But I do think that this TCU team is worse. There's less I'm concerned about here. There's less that I think TCU can really expose from Texas Tech all around. So I'm going to take the Red Raiders in a 67-57 victory over TCU. I think that the Red Raiders should win comfortably. 10 games at home or 10 points at home in the Big 12. I think that's a win that you take. Got to contain Mike Miles. Got to get your ball handlers to the rim and to the free throw line. Got to make shots. Got to move the ball. But if you do all that, I mean, you're the better team. I really do feel that. I think that I said that about Oklahoma as well. And I still think that's true. The execution just was not there on Wednesday. But with this game, I really do feel like you're the better team. I really do feel like you can execute better, especially with what this defense wants to do. So I got the Red Raiders 67-57.
Yeah, in the past, the TCU game has been kind of a means for therapy for Texas Tech. I mean, I remember back in the 2019 game where Tech was coming off a three-game losing streak and managed to put together an absolutely dominant win at home on Big Monday that kind of spark plugged their run. -1 loss to Kansas and Allen Fieldhouse. Last year, they decimated TCU at home in the middle of a three-game winning streak right before the tournament. Even back in 2020, in the midst of what was probably one of the most frustrating seasons of recent memory, they still absolutely destroyed TCU by 46 points at home. So at home, Tech has had their success against TCU as of late, and I think that it's going to continue. This is a very different TCU team than what we've seen. It's a lot more versatile. That's one of the biggest surprises for me this year is just how much the identity for Jamie Dixon's squad has changed. Because if you remember a couple years back, it was kind of the opposite. You had a lot of guys like Kenrick Williams, like certainly Kevin Samuels, even to some degree you had, or Kevin Samuel, even to some degree Desmond Bain. Like Bain was probably the most versatile piece that they had, and even him, he was more of just in general not being someone that you could really rely on defensively. So they really struggled at times on the defensive end just because of that. And I think this team's completely opposite. They've got a lot of strength on the defensive side of things and really versatile as well. But offensively, they just haven't been able to put it together. So I'm going to go pretty low scoring on this one, which is kind of a breaking tendency for a Tech TCU game at home. In the past, Tech has been able to hit 80. I think it's 4 of the last 5 games. Not going to continue on this one. I'm going to go with Tech winning this one 70-59. I think it's going to be a close game, but Tech's going to be able to pull it out at the end. And I just don't trust TCU's half-court offense being able to create enough looks to keep it really close down the stretch.
Yeah, we're close on this one. And if history tells us anything, it's that TCU and Iowa State and Lubbock have been really good opportunities for Texas Tech to kind of recalibrate and get a win to boost their momentum. Before we get out of here today, how many times did I say LSU instead of TCU?
By my count, twice. You did it at the start, and then you did it when you were talking about the defense as one of your keys, but wasn't too bad. But I noticed it. The first time I was like, oh, maybe it's just a slip up. And the second I was like, oh, God. It was not ideal.
I have no idea why that's happening. I mean, I'm fairly certain that I know that Texas Tech is not playing LSU in their conference slate. I think defensively, these teams kind of remind me of each other. I think that LSU has been a lot better at TCU than executing the defensive scheme, and I know that they've played each other. I wish Texas Tech was playing LSU. That'd be a fun game. It'd be like 44-40 for the final.
Yeah. Maybe in the tournament. Maybe we can see one of those good old 42-37 rock fights.
The Johan Troyer game. Hopefully Texas Tech can get some redemption there against Will Wade after he snuck in and stole Texas Tech's recruit. But thank you all for listening to our TCU preview episode. Hope you enjoy the game on Saturday at 3 o'clock. If you're in Lubbock, try and get your butt in a seat. Go make some noise. Have some fun with Raider Riot. I think it's pajama day, so enjoy the early tip-off and some good basketball. I'm sure that Texas Tech will have plenty of entertaining things to show for. In the meantime, over the course of the weekend, you can keep up with us on social. You can follow me at rmanvillelbk. You can follow Emery at eraser41. You can follow the official Locked On Texas Tech Twitter page at LockedOnTTU. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you have not already. It is a great, great help to us. Thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. Now be sure to make your second listen Locked On Bets, your daily one-stop shop for all your gambling needs. Locked On Bets, hosted by your boy Q with expert analysis and insight from Lee Sterling. It's free and available on all platforms. Thanks for joining us. Have a good weekend.